Good morning, everyone. I'm Gina Studam. I'm the president of the Wyoming County Chamber of Commerce, and we are happy that you all have joined us this morning for our Restart, Rebound, Rebuild webinar series. We are working with all of you to determine how we can best get restarted and come through this pandemic with a strong economy and a strong workforce. And this morning, we want to talk about some of the HR concerns that you may have, but also the new Pennsylvania personal protection equipment order. So we have on the call with us this morning, Brad Giorgetti, who's the Human Resource Manager for Deer Park Lumber and Shadowbrook Resort. And we have Pat Staples, and she is the Senior Human Resource Specialist for the C3 group. Both of these people will be provided some time to speak about different aspects of human resources, and then we will give you some time at the end to ask your questions of them. We will also have time on Friday with this group to talk about questions that have been unanswered or that we may need to research a little more. So without further ado, Brad, you're on the call.
I am.
Okay, great. So Brad, again, works with Deer Park Lumber, who, as many of you know, is a life-sustaining essential business. So he has been working with them all through this, and the new Pennsylvania personal protection equipment order really affects them and what they're doing at their workplace. So I've asked Brad to just talk a little bit about that order this morning and measures that they are taking for protecting their employees and as they might pertain to businesses, again, as we slowly get open here in Pennsylvania.
Okay, thank you, Gina. So as Gina mentioned, there was an order issued by the Pennsylvania Secretary of Health, and that order was issued on April 15th. With an execution or implementation date of April 19th. The order has primarily four focal points to it. One is the building safety measures, and it's in addition to the original directive that was submitted on April 16th by the Pennsylvania Secretary of Health regarding how to maintain a safe work environment, mitigate risk for employees. There's also an aspect of the procedural response action. So this is addressing those individuals or workplaces if you have a confirmed COVID diagnosis or a probable, it provides some guidance on procedural or protocol that would be beneficial to employers. And then, as Gina mentioned, the most impactful is the general work industry or the work environment itself. And highlighting that is the required masking that really took effect yesterday, but certainly is part of our world here at Deer Park Lumber and Shadowbrook Resort as of today. So I just want to real quickly, with regard to the building safety measures, that's the enhanced cleaning aspect. That's increasing frequency. It's disinfecting and cleaning all common areas. That's the break rooms, break room tables, break room chairs, workstations. Employees should be responsible for throughout the day disinfecting their work areas. Here at Deer Park Lumber and also at Shadowbrook, our motto is if it's touched, it needs to be disinfected several times per day. The other aspect is, and I also want to add too, is that it's always a good idea as best you can to develop procedures and protocols in documentation form, because that also helps with regard to the communication plan for the employees. So this is not only a leadership endeavor, this needs to be all of the employees as well. So include them in the documentation piece, include them that we're communicating, that they understand what they're responsible for and what really they're accountable for. The other aspect I'm going to skip over, and I'll save that for last. I know I have 5 minutes, and that's the procedural response plan in the event of a confirmed diagnosis. and I want to go into the general work environment. So the work environment had a significant change, and that's required masking for all employees. And this required masking is for employees that are on all of the property. So there's also a retail or for businesses that have direct interaction with the public. This will also impact you because there's a customer or community or public responsibility and requirement as well to this. So in essence, for my world here at Deer Park Lumber in Shadowbrook, the required masking is an extension now of the required PPE. Masks must be worn at all times by all of our employees, regardless of circumstance. As soon as they leave their vehicle, they have to have a mask on. So going to the retail or the public, masks must be worn on the premises by employees and customers. Entry can be denied to customers or individuals entering the workplace. Now, I do want to mention that Saturday night, the Department of Health also issued some clarification guidelines with regard to the required masking, and I just want to take a second here and cover that. So the Department of Health did not provide any type of guidelines as far as what these masks need to be, or do they need to be certified? They don't. They're leaving it open to a face covering. It literally can be a bandana. It can be a face shield. Face shields are acceptable. It can be a homemade mask. Through the Department of Health, there are some guidelines with regard to how to make a mask at home. So really up to the employer on how they want to interpret and implement masking procedures with regard to what is an acceptable mask. Here at Deer Park Lumber, we do allow face shields. We do allow homemade masks. We do allow bandanas. There's also some ski material that we've authorized as well. Our bottom line is to make sure as best we can that they're covering. Questions have started to arise already, if such as a financial institution which was provided for clarification. So if you're in an office environment where you have either yourself and another individual or multiple individuals, those employees must be masked at all times. If you are in an office by yourself, like I'm standing here in my office with no one here, I am not required to wear a mask, so obviously I'm not. So with regard to retail businesses and businesses that are dealing with customers, if a customer refuses to wear a mask, they can be turned away. However, the recommendation, and obviously I would think for most businesses, alternate arrangements would be made, whether it's curbside service or if there's a potential for delivery. Also, the other aspect to this too is that if someone informs you, whether it's I want to talk about customer first or with the general public, if they inform you that they cannot wear a mask for health reasons, they can be permitted access to the business or to the retail establishment. You're not allowed to ask them for any documentation or any proof from a public standpoint, and you can allow them access, or you can attempt to work out arrangements to, like I said, curbside or delivery. That's a little different than if it's an employee who is indicating to you that they cannot wear a mask for health reasons. As the employer, you do have the right to receive medical confirmation on that. If, in fact, there are some instances where, such as asthma or other related illnesses, that a mask is not required, then the obligation or the effort should be made by the employer to make reasonable accommodations. Those accommodations can be, can we put this individual in a more isolated type of work environment in order to maintain less risk, not only to that individual, but also to other individuals as well. I know I'm cutting short for time here. I do want to just talk real quick regarding the procedural response. This one in particular, I really stress the importance of developing a rapid response plan in the event you do have an exposure at your workplace of a confirmed or probable COVID-19. The Secretary of Health and the Department of Health regulations and requirements are, if you do have exposed, you close off that particular work area or workstation or office for a period of 24 hours. So it becomes isolated. Nobody goes into it. If it's recommended, if you can, to open it up to the outside air. It goes through an intensive cleaning after the 24-hour period, along with the entire workplace. And then the other important aspect of this is contact mapping. As best you can, for a 48-hour period prior, try to identify everybody that this individual has been in contact with. There's a confidentiality requirement here, so as you're contact mapping back 48 hours, you're notifying the individuals that there is a potential risk that you have been potentially exposed. You want to notify them that, but as you best, please do not use the employee's name, nor should you reference the employee's gender. So there's a confidentiality aspect to this that has to be maintained to protect the medical confidentiality of the employee that has potential exposure or confirmed diagnosis with the COVID. But as best you can, you need to notify those employees, encourage them to seek medical attention, to be tested for COVID-19. And then I really do leave it up. Our current policy here at Deer Park Lumber is, what do you do with the individuals that have been in contact with that? We literally take it on a case-by-case basis because of the security system and the cameras that we have accessible here. We look at the individual if there was an extended period of interaction or if there was a close proximity with that individual within the workplace. We will self-isolate that individual with pay off of the workplace so that they can't be tested. But again, that's a independent decision that each organization needs to make on their own. And I've already exceeded my time. So there's, as I said, the Secretary or the Department of Health has issued some clarifications to the order that was issued on April 15th that became effective yesterday. I could certainly send it to Gina and happy to share it with you. But again, the big onus is safety, maintaining a safe work environment through disinfection and cleaning, and the required masking.
Very good. Brad, I thank you so much for your thorough explanation of all that. It certainly is a lot to read, and the order has a lot of details involved in it. So I appreciate you reviewing that and even reviewing the updated order. We're going to keep moving in. Again, if you have any questions regarding that, please type them into the chat. We will try to get to them today. If we don't get to them today, we will get to them on Friday when we do our wrap-up call. Next, I want to introduce Pat Staples. Again, Pat is the Senior Human Resource Specialist for the C3 group, and she's going to talk with us today about the Family First Corona Care Act legislation. This was a part of the CARES Act, and it extended what we all know as the Family and Medical Leave Act. If you get hurt in the workplace or if you are out on maternity leave, your leave falls under the Family Medical Leave Act. So we have today, we have Pat joining us, and she is going to talk with us about that act and answer some questions that we have already arranged. So Pat, first and foremost, tell us about the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act and who is eligible.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, all employees of employers of 500 or fewer are eligible for paid sick leave, and those are 10 days, a maximum of 80 hours. Full-time employees would be eligible for up to 80 hours, even if they would work more than 40 hours in a week. Part-time employees are anyone who works under 40 hours a week, and their hours are based on their 10 days, but they're based on their regularly scheduled work hours. And the DOL has advised that if you have employees who work varied schedules and varied hours, that you actually do a 6-month look back to determine the average number of hours that the individual would be eligible for.
And then again, who qualifies for an employee? What qualifies an employee? I'm sorry, what qualifies an employee for the paid sick leave under the Act?
It's actually any employee. There are no hour restrictions. There are no time restrictions. Unlike the expanded family medical leave, an employee has to be employed for a minimum of 30 calendar days. But essentially, to be eligible for the paid sick leave, you could be employed for a week.
Okay. And then is this just if the employee themselves get sick with the coronavirus, or is this for taking care of someone, a child?
No, well, there are 6 scenarios that entitle individuals to be eligible for the paid sick leave, and that is firstly, if they are subject to federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation orders, if they have been advised by a healthcare provider to self-quarantine related to COVID-19. If they are experiencing COVID-19 symptoms and are seeking a medical diagnosis. And it's important to note here that paid sick leave under that particular scenario is only limited to the time that they are unable to work because they are taking affirmative steps to obtain a diagnosis. So that would be whether they're making appointments, waiting for an appointment, attending an appointment, but it would not apply to an entire day. So it's only for the time that they are actively seeking a diagnosis. If they're also eligible for the time if they are caring for an individual that is either applies in that first scenario I mentioned or the second one. And it's important also to note that individual in this situation is defined as an immediate family member or one who regularly resides in the home. And under that category, the paid sick leave, they are only eligible for 2/3 of their pay. The next scenario is if an individual is off because they are caring for a child whose school or place of care has been closed related to COVID-19. Again, that's a 2/3 payment. And then finally, and this is sort of a catch-all, and I've really never seen any clarification on this, is that if the individual is experiencing any other substantially similar condition specified by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in consultation with the Secretaries of Labor and Treasury. So that's kind of a catch-all. Again, I've not seen anything that really describes what that might be. I think we'll sort of have to play that by ear, and if you think that you may have that scenario, then we can cross that bridge when we come to it. That also is a situation where you're eligible for 2/3 of your pay. I think it's also important to add that employees subject to quarantine and isolation orders are not eligible if they are otherwise able to telework, if the employer has work for the employee to perform, and there are not extenuating circumstances preventing them from working. And again, this extenuating circumstances is sort of it's defined, it's actually not defined, it's just a very broad term. And originally, the guidance was that these stay-at-home orders really don't apply, but it seems now there's a little more clarification, and it can be that they apply that you could be eligible potentially for those paid sick days.
Great, thank you. So I know that with the original Family Medical Leave Act, there are employers who are excluded because they don't have a certain number of employees. Are there any employers in this scenario that are excluded from the extensions to these acts?
There is an exemption for small employers. They include religious groups and nonprofits. The qualifications are they must be fewer than 50 employees, and it only applies to the leave taken for childcare purposes, not the other categories that I just described. And in order for them to be exempt, it would have to stop the business from essentially operating at their minimal capacity, that there would be a risk to operations because of the skills of the people who would be impacted by this, and perhaps that there would not be sufficient workforce available to be able to do the work. If you read any of the guidance from the DOL, they will say very clearly, if you feel that you fall into this category, don't send us anything because we're not in a position to be able to respond. So what they have said is that you should document, if you feel that you're in a situation that you have to exempt your employees from this act for this reason, that you document it and that you hold on to it in case you're ever challenged or audited because you exempted employees from that.
Okay. So there is no process to apply for the exclusion at this point.
No, there is not.
Okay. Okay. And then let's talk a little bit, which I think you covered, but what is the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act? And that's the 6 pieces, and that extends that paid sick leave, that 2 weeks, that extends that a bit further. So let's talk about that.
Well, the first, and again, it's important to note that the Expansion Act, again, applies to individuals who are unable to work because either the school or their child care provider is not available. And so the initial 10 days under the Expansion Act are unpaid. However, the employee could request to use the 10 days under the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. They could also use available time to them through their employers. And then after that initial 10 days, and those 10 days are, again, they're paid at the 2/3 amount, then there are an additional 10 weeks that the individual could apply for that extended family leave. And in order to do that, and in all these cases, you would want to get documentation for both the paid sick leave as well as the expanded family medical leave. But in the case of someone requesting leave for the purposes of childcare, they have to identify the child by name, by age. They have to specifically state that there are no other individuals who are able to care for the child. So essentially that they are the sole caretaker for the child during this period of time. And then some documentation that shows that that the school or the daycare provider are closed. And that could be a newspaper clipping, an email. There are a lot of different things that you would want to have to be able to approve that loan that time, but also to be able to have that for your tax credit purposes so that you can show that that you have paid that individual that for that period of time. So again, they have the first 10 days are essentially listed as unpaid, but they don't necessarily have to be. And then that additional up to 10 weeks at 2/3 pay. Now, it's important to note too, and this has changed a bit from an FMLA standpoint. Originally, the guidance was that this was in addition to the 12 weeks that are granted under FMLA, but that is not the case. So if someone has already taken, say, 2 weeks or 3 weeks of FMLA for another reason, then they are only entitled to the balance of this for the expanded leave.
That's a good thing to know, Pat. Thank you. What we talked about the limits under the Act. So if the employee themselves is sick, then they receive their full pay, correct, other than the first 2 weeks.
Well, they would, if an employee is, for any of these, if they're quarantined or they're self-isolated, they could receive full pay, but there are limits on that. And that full pay would be based upon their current pay rate. There's a limit of $511 per day for those 10 days. And that coincides with those first 3 reasons for using the paid sick leave. And then under the remaining 3, then that's 2/3 pay, and there's a limit of $200 per day. And that's based upon 2/3 of their regular rate or 2/3 of the applicable minimum wage, whichever is higher.
So there is certainly a lot in this Act as well, Pat. I think that the main thing about all of the changes that are happening right now in the legislation that's coming out is to really contact a specialist. And that's what the C3 group does. So, and they are members of the chamber. And I want to let everyone know that they've been obviously a great help with coordinating this webinar and future webinars. And if you have questions as they do pertain or something very specific to your company, certainly you could reach out to your group. Correct, Pat?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are so many moving parts, and it's basically a full-time job just to keep up with the various changes. So we're certainly happy to help anyone that has any questions, if just some additional guidance that you might need. I would also offer that the Department of Labor, their site does have some 60 frequently asked questions that I think are very helpful, but at the same time, when you read those, they may be a little confusing. So we certainly are able to provide some additional guidance. And if I could just mention one other thing relative to unemployment. The Pennsylvania unemployment website has some really valuable information that will help any manager, HR manager, business owner to understand the different, again, there are several moving parts from an unemployment perspective, but they do have a scenarios and benefit guide available on that site. And it talks about eligibility for paid sick leave, expanded medical leave, unemployment compensation, workers' compensation, and it provides a list of various scenarios and what someone might be eligible for. And I find it pretty interesting because I've been looking at this for the last couple of weeks and it continues to change. So I think it would be very helpful. And again, the C3 group, we can certainly help you relative to eligibility for these benefits and how it may coordinate with the Pennsylvania unemployment laws.
We appreciate that, Pat. And what I'll do is on your screen right now, you should see resources and upcoming webinars. This is a link on the chamber page. So if you go to WyCCC.com, you will click on that COVID box, and then you'll see our Restart, Rebound, Rebuild program. All of our webinars are being recorded. you'll see the recordings, but you'll also see links underneath those recordings for things that were mentioned in the videos. So I will ask Pat to send me those links she just mentioned, and I will post those with today's information. And you can see that I've also already posted the U.S. Chamber's coronavirus paid leave programs for, it's an employer guide. That's a very basic, I think it's 2 or 3 pages, very basic guide to these employer leave programs. It talks about the different rates that you need to pay based on if they're caring for a loved one or if they're caring for their children. And it also talks about those 6 qualifying factors. So you'll be able to see that. I've posted the new PPP order from Pennsylvania and the Secretary of Health. And I've also posted a very helpful Families First Coronavirus Response Act flowchart that says, you know, this is a scenario I have in my workplace. Do they qualify? And it walks you through that. So take a look at those 3 pieces. We do have a question that has come in, Pat, and I don't know if you can see the chat on your screen there. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see the chat box. But I'll read the question. It says, I heard that employers need to pay employees even if they typically do not get sick pay. What qualifies in terms of a medical condition or high risk? If the person has COPD or respiratory problems, are they paid at the full amount?
Okay.
This may be a very specific question that we may need to follow up on as far as be in direct contact with this.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly answer that separately. You know, the paid sick leave applies to these 6 specific categories that I've outlined, which are the quarantine, if they've been advised by a healthcare provider. So in this case, if someone has been advised in the situation where they have a respiratory problem or COPD, then they could qualify. And again, I'd kind of like to maybe get a little more specifics on that, because it's hard to tell from this whether or not they have been advised by a healthcare provider and they have something that they could show as documentation that they have that, or is this just sort of a, well, I have this condition and I think I shouldn't go to work. So they would qualify, again, if this is the case, if they qualify under that, they would be entitled to those 10 paid sick days, but that is the limit. Now, if they have a serious health condition that may qualify them for FMLA under the regular provisions of FMLA, then that's a different thing. And obviously FMLA generally is unpaid unless the employer has time that the individual can use. So I would be happy to answer this question specifically if you'd like to have that person contact me.
And Pat, do you mind if when we share today's webinar, would you mind if I posted your contact information?
Oh, that would be fine. That's great.
Thank you so much. So we're going to wrap here today because, again, I'm trying to keep these videos to 30 minutes. I appreciate all of you being on the call. I hope that we have provided some great information. I'd like to thank Brad and Pat for sharing their knowledge with us and being a valuable resource to the Chamber, but also to our Chamber members at this time. We hope you will join us for Wednesday's call as we're going to talk about group health benefits and also labor law issues. And then on Friday, as I mentioned, we will have a wrap-up of this. That is a member exclusive, and you can register right on our website. And we'll talk in more of an open forum about questions that you may have or questions that have come up. So thank you again. I hope you have a great week and a wonderful Monday. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.